Good evening to you. I'm Don Carlton. I'm the Executive Director of the Dolph Briscoe Center here at the University of Texas. And I welcome you heartily to our special program tonight. We're here really for two important reasons. And the first is to celebrate the addition to the Briscoe Center of a fabulous archive, which fully documents the outstanding career of renowned photographer Joan Myers. The other purpose is to celebrate the Briscoe Center's publication of The Devil's Highway. That book, which we will have available to you out in the hall after the program, features Joan Myers haunting, and it is haunting black and white images of the fracturing of the American dream, the demise of cowboy culture, and the shrinking of small towns, ranches, and farms throughout Western rural America. Now, in a moment, I'll ask Joan to come forward, as well as our other guests, who I will also introduce in a minute. Anyway, I'll ask them to come up here with Dr. Sarah Sonner, who is the director of the Briscoe Center's exhibit program, and who has curated the wonderful exhibits out in our galleries out here that I hope you will go see during the reception. Now, they're going to discuss Joan's archive and the brilliant book. But at first, I want to tell you about Joan Myers, as well as author William deBuys, whose short story serves as a text to our new book. Joan Myers has spent a major portion of her life visually recording with consummate skill the reality of the ever-changing landscape and culture of the Western United States. She's been taking pictures for more than 45 years, much of the time roaming the American West, but also in places as far-flung as India, the Canary Islands, Antarctica, and Sicily, among many other locations. Her work has been the subject of 3 Smithsonian exhibitions, more than 50 solo shows, and 11 books. Joan's photographs are included in the permanent collections of several prestigious cultural institutions, including the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, the National Library of France, the George Eastman House Museum of Photography, the Houston Museum of Fine Art, and New York City's Museum of Modern Art. After many years of residency in Santa Fe, Joan recently moved to Tucson, Arizona. I also want to bring well-deserved attention to the other contributor to The Devil's Highway, writer and conservationist Bill deBuys, whose powerfully evocative short story serves as an unusual text, as well as the title of this book, by the way. By unusual, by the way, when I said the unusual, I refer to the fact that it's fiction, which is an entirely new approach for us, a history center. In his own talented way, Bill uses fiction to convey the same realities of change that Joan Myers preserves photographically. As many historians and journalists will admit, or they should anyway, fiction is often better equipped than nonfiction in its ability to convey the attitudes, feelings, emotions, and spirit of time and place. His short story is a wonderful example. Bill, who lives in Santa Fe, is the author of 10 books, including River of Traps, A Village Life, which is published by the University of New Mexico Press. And it was honored, that book was honored as a Pulitzer Prize nonfiction finalist. Bill's previous collaboration with Joan Myers was Salt Dreams, Land and Earth in Lowdown, California. Sarah, you might want to get to the bottom of that particular title. And that is also published by the University of New Mexico Press. That book also, interestingly enough, inspired the highly acclaimed film, The Colorado. I want to add that Bill is also a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, and he was a student in American Studies. So we have a faculty member from American Studies with us tonight, who I'm sure will be proud. I also want to acknowledge and thank Joanna Hurley of Hurley Media in Santa Fe, who actually produced this book, this beautiful book, with such great skill. It's really been, I have to say, really been a delight to work with you, Joanna, wherever you may be. Stand up and please be recognized, Joanna. Yeah. My thanks also go to my friend Andy Smith of Andrew Smith Gallery in Tucson, Arizona, for introducing me to Joan Myers. And also I want to thank Dr. Holly Taylor, who is head of publications here at the Briscoe Center. And she's done her typically expert job representing the center in this project. I'd also like to acknowledge our friends at the University of Texas Press. They serve as our distributor, and they're a great partner in our publishing program. The Joan Myers Photographic Archive joins those of more than 50 leading documentary photographers and photojournalists here at the Briscoe Center. Launched 30 years ago, the center's program to preserve visual evidence documenting American history has built a collection now totaling nearly 9 million images. And finally, I do want to also thank, of course, focus my acknowledgement and thank you to Joan Myers herself, not only for entrusting her archive to the Briscoe Center, but also for generously allowing us to publish The Devil's Highway. Now, after our program, I want to invite all of you to a reception out here in the hallway gallery, where you can buy as many copies of The Devil's Highway as you would like. And also, Bill and Joan have graciously agreed to actually sign all of your books that you buy. So I hope you take advantage of that. So now it's my pleasure to bring Joan and Sarah and Bill up to the front, to the chairs here, to have a conversation about Joan's archive and this new book. Please join me in welcoming.
So I'll just echo Dr. Carlton's thank you for bringing the archive to us, and we're just delighted to have you at the Briscoe Center. So Joan, I wanted to start by asking you about the scope of your archive. As Dr. Carlton mentioned, your work reveals the relationships of landscape and human occupation, along with projects that document people in everyday life. And I wondered about this, in thinking about the scope of your work as a whole, were those always major themes for you, or how have those emerged for you over time?
Well, first I have to thank Don Carlton and all the staff here at the Briscoe. You've been absolutely terrific. The whole process of getting the archive here and then of working on the book, I mean, it's just been easy and a pleasure, and I'm totally honored to have my archive here and just really pleased that the book has come out from here. So thank you to everybody. There's too many people to thank again, but many thanks. In terms of the sort of themes that go back in my work, I mean, I guess I've been working now since 1974 is when I started. So we're talking almost 50 years at this point. I was trained as a musician, and you know, musicology, actually. I played early instruments, and and then I had little kids, and it was too difficult to continue to do the things that I was doing. And I'd also, at that point, left the Bay Area and moved to Los Angeles. Los Angeles was very difficult to organize performances. You had to drive for, an hour to get to a rehearsal. And kind of in desperation and whatever, I took an extension class from UCLA in photography and loved it. My interests in high school were science, mathematics, foreign language, sort of classical disciplines. And the combination with music, which is a very subjective field, they both came together in photography for me. And when I started in Los Angeles, the first thing I did was, I wanted to photograph landscape, right? Here I am in the middle of the city. I lived in Manhattan Beach. And I grew up in Des Moines. So the feeling of the importance of landscape, has always been there for me. So I started to photograph the weeds and walls of the city as if they were landscapes. And there were always weeds growing up, there was graffiti, I had people posing for me. So it was that combination of people and landscape, sort of human occupation of the landscape, goes back to that really early work. And then it continued, actually, for, I was asked, I was shooting pretty freely in those early days. I didn't really know what I was doing at all. But when I moved to New Mexico in 1979, I was asked to be part of a project called the New Mexico Photographic Survey. And there were 13 of us, I think, that got the last NEA survey grant to photograph different things around the state. And when I looked on the map, I was a pretty new arrival, I saw this little dotted line that said Old Santa Fe Trail. I went up through the northeastern corner of the state. And I said, that's what I'll do. I'll see what's out there. And I quickly realized I had to do some research. There was a bibliography of 500 books on the Santa Fe Trail, and I knew nothing. So that was kind of the beginning of actually doing research as well as going out to photograph. And I found I loved that combination of study and then going out to photograph, and then I'd see all the things I didn't understand. I go back, do some more research, and continued like that. So the sort of human occupation of the landscape goes way back for me.
And you write in Devil's Highway of this feeling of freedom and independence that you gained spending time in the West, Colorado, visiting there during summers as you grew up traveling from Iowa. So what has it been like to keep returning to these landscapes over the years?
In some ways it's kind of sad, because these landscapes that were, kind of romantic when I was a teenager or later when I began to travel by car don't look like that anymore. And small towns that were bustling places with the hardware store and the grocery store, they don't look like that anymore. Now, if you're in this little town, you might have to go, 25, 30 miles to get to, there might be a dollar store, but nothing else. And your hospital is going to be considerably further than that away. So, to some degree it's a little sad, but the spirit of small towns remains, and people who continue to live in rural areas are hardy folks. And, I have a great deal of respect for that. And that part has remained unchanged. I really enjoy returning.
The book itself, The Devil's Highway, refers to Route 666, which has since been renamed, given a different numerical designation. And I noticed in going through the book that it features that road alongside this iconic American highway, Route 66. So I wanted to maybe ask you both, how do you see those roads relating to one another as places in the American imagination?
This is one for you.
Well, but both of these roads are sort of mythic highways, and countless people have followed them for their journeys, going off, to quote Paul Simon, to look for America. And these are roads of quest. And I think the quest is probably the oldest story form in human communication. And so these are natural subjects for a photographer or for a writer to examine these avenues along which so many people, so often over such a long time, have looked for the stories to structure their world.
And I remember you referring to the road as a kind of border. And I was interested as how they cross paths, they cross states as paths, but they also contain these lives in these small towns. And we've got a couple of examples back here, Kingman, Arizona among them, too, which is one of those cities that gets called out in the song about Route 66, too. And your previous book, which was called Where the Buffalo Roams, included landscapes photographed in color. And for this book, you chose black and white and wrote that it's more personal. So how would you describe your relationship to working in black and white versus color, and what it evokes for you in these images?
Well, I started out really as a black and white photographer. I mean, until digital came along, I was all black and white, 4x5 film, all black and white. I didn't really switch. I never shot any color. I mean, I shot some slides when I would go on a project just to sort of document what was out there, but it was all black and white until I went to Antarctica, which was 2002. And I was there on there's a program that National Science Foundation has where they send down artists and writers as part of the research station. So I spent 4 months in Antarctica. And digital was new. I mean, I had the very first Nikon digital camera, and I also took down film cameras. And it was so much easier to shoot the digital, even if I didn't really know what I was doing, that I did that a lot. And while I was down there, I had a person back in Santa Fe that I could manage to get the images sent back. Digitally, they had enough connection there to do that. So once a week, she would post a journal entry, sort of what I've been doing that week, and color pictures. And when I got back, my gallery person, Andy Smith, I said, he said, I want to show some work. I said, okay. Came over, took a look. He said, I want to show color. And I went, oh. I never really considered that the end product was going to be color, but he encouraged me to do that. And then there was actually eventually a Smithsonian traveling show of that Antarctic work. So I found I really liked color. And I had been adding hand color, both oil and pastel and watercolor all the way along. So, I had my own sort of sense of what color was about. And so, when I started photographing the West again, wandering about and working on the photographs for Buffalo, I saw a lot of images that really struck me in color. There was a lot of iconography, murals, things like that really required color, I thought. But at the same time, when I wandered a place and sort of did a snapshot here and there, they always seemed to I wanted to print them in black and white. So when I finished that book, I had a lot of outtakes, and I realized that there was a book there that was quite different from the color work, that gave more a sense of the sort of feeling of these places. And I think black and white is better for that.
There's something about the quality of the contrast that makes you focus on these details, I think, as a viewer, for me at least. And also in your work, I notice a lot of layers to the imagery. This can be literal landscape strata, layers of signs that recede along a street, or dollars attached to the interior of a bar in Oatman, or even those vistas with objects like the phone booth that point to this wider cultural change, these disappeared parts of the landscape. So I wondered how you approach thinking about these kinds of visual details. Is there one thing that captures you, or do you wait and see what you notice once you see the final image?
Well, I've been photographing a long time, and I realized that, I'm now able to put more information in my photographs than I could when I started. Details, early on, I would, in fact, for the archive here, I spent a lot of time looking through early black and white film negatives and contact sheets, and I was totally dismayed by the number of failures. But I guess, at some point you get better. And I find that I really like being able to put a lot of detail in a picture. You still have to have something central, but I like that when you look at this photograph, you have different levels that you see. You might see the man or whatever it is, yes, the man there first, but then you're going to see the whole bar, and you're going to start saying, oh, look at that, and look at that. And I really like that.
It really rewards close looking.
And it means that you see a lot of material culture as a result of that.
Definitely. And another thing that I noticed was that there's this tension between nostalgia for this idea of the American West and the wear and tear that you can see of everyday life in these images. So you mentioned the murals, and we've got one that shows this painted cowgirl on the side of a building. And then in the foreground, there's a truck that's been repaired with what looks like duct tape as well. And then we've got another one that shows this big Tex figure, I think that's his name, right? That he appears in this alleyway. And so I was thinking about whether nostalgia ever gets in the way of documenting the truth of people living in these towns, and how economic changes that are visible really have this tension with ideas of the American West, and I wondered about that.
Well, I think there's always a possibility of falling over the edge into total nostalgia, and I try and not go there. On the other hand, if there's too much contemporary, then there's no sense of the myth of the American West. You lose that. So these two things sort of fight all the time or balance each other all the time, and I try and walk right down the middle. I mean, I frankly have never seen myself as a documentary photographer, despite my wonderful presence here at the Briscoe. I've always tried to walk a line between fine art and documentary, and the documentary people don't quite claim me, and the fine art people don't either. And that's where I want to be, right down the middle.
Never get claimed.
Exactly.
Really good policy. I would just add, part of what Joan's doing is capturing not just the iconography of this old view of the American West, but looking at the iconography as it decays, which it deserves to do. And in that sense, it's a very contemporary document. And I think it's not an elegy for the old American West, but it's a current dry-eyed appraisal of an ideology whose time has passed.
That's right. I think that's really important. I mean, I was aware of that all the time. I mean, we have this myth of the American West and all the possibilities and everything that's gone with that. But when you stop to think about it, you realize it didn't include women, didn't include Native Americans, didn't include Hispanics. I mean, it was a very limited American dream. And now we're in a place where we're trying really hard to be more inclusive. And we haven't come up with a new American dream yet that fits that. But I'm hoping that maybe our kids and grandkids will find a way to do that and bring us back together with something that's still sort of glowing out there. Because right now, it doesn't feel like we have a lot of that.
Thinking about this rendering of dreams and watching them as their evidence decays over time, one of the things that also emerges are these painted murals that you talked about photographing in color before, but in the book in black and white, they really strike me as painting a backdrop onto a surface that itself is a backdrop. So you get this extra layer of meaning here. So I wondered about the significance of this kind of vernacular artwork that appears and reappears and maybe advertises businesses or evokes even an entirely different place than you might be standing in.
Garage, yeah. I think one of the things that surprised me going to small towns all over the West is that a lot of them are on really hard times, and they have really a sort of desperate feeling when you walk down Main Street with all the buildings boarded up, and there might be a cafe, but that's about it. And then other towns are thriving, even though they may not have all the services they used to have. There's a good spirit in town. And one thing that really surprised me was that a lot of towns have a mural program. And this is new, and I don't know, I'm not a cultural historian, I don't know what's caused this to happen. I'd be really interested if somebody would write a book about it, but I find everywhere I go, I'm seeing murals now, and the towns that have the murals are doing quite well, as opposed to the ones that don't. It's a way of getting a sense of pride in your community, and sometimes the city itself will give a little money to the mural painters, at least provide them paint. There was a great mural painter in Tucumcari. This is actually in Tucumcari. This is not one of his murals, but I found later I ran into the same man painting in Benson, Arizona, which is 500 miles away. And I said, so what happened? Why are you here? And he said, well, they're paying me. They're giving me food and paint. And then he went back to Tucumcari. So I don't know what's going on in the mural world, but it's really interesting, and there's some great mural painters out there. Tucson now has murals everywhere.
Did you say this was a garage?
Yes, this is inside a garage. It's a sort of open garage, and somebody has. This is the Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari, which is an old motel.
Highly recommend it.
It is it's a Route 66 motel.
I think it has one of those iconic neon signs.
It
out
does.
front
It has
as
an
well.
incredible with a swallow, blue swallow.
Well, I like that you've included a photograph of the garage as well, so you see it from all different
There are
angles
too many
too.
pictures of it. Yeah.
So thinking about those kinds of symbols and icons of the American West, I wanted to show this image because we can see this model horse and a bull, a cowboy hat, there's a wagon wheel, and there are these other objects inside this plate glass store window. And I'm interested in how those icons and symbols have become commodities and even antiques now. And that kind of iconic representation is really persistent, even as things decay around them. So how does finding these and contextualizing these in your work, how does that guide what you look at? And this can be a question for both of you maybe too.
I'll start. Well, I think Hollywood basically started this image of the American West. Even before that, there were paintings and drawings and novels, but Hollywood really created the myth of the American West, I believe. And all of these objects, they go back to those Westerns. And that imagery is everywhere. It doesn't matter how sad the town is, or you can walk down Main Street. This is Douglas, Arizona, which is one of your places. This is where his short story starts. And it's a border town. It's not a really exciting town. It's it's a sort of hard scrabble border town. But they have windows like this, and I like that tension between the sort of struggle in this town and the survival of this imagery.
You've probably heard that within the mafia today, the movie The Godfather is deeply studied, and people imitate characters in The Godfather because that's viewed as that's how mobsters like us should behave. Not far from Douglas once, I spent a couple of days at a ranch that belonged to a fellow who was third generation there. His granddad had come, right at the end of the Apache Wars. He was about 6'3", lean as you can imagine. He was a mountain lion hunter. He's the guy who confronted the stray jaguar that wound up in the Palancios. He could ride like crazy. He was a cattleman. He was a hunter. All this stuff. And in his house, he had a little museum that was dominated by a life-size cutout of John Wayne. So here was the real deal worshiping the fake deal, you know? And that dialogue goes on throughout the West all the time. It is fascinating. And I think that's something that Joan gets to in her work.
And I'm sorry I couldn't spend more time in Texas because you've definitely got it all here.
So I've got a question for both of you. Bill, what inspired you to write your short story, The Devil's Highway? And Joan, what led you to choosing this story of Bill's in particular for this book?
I'll take that one first and leave you the story. When I was putting these photographs together and trying to figure out what sort of text would go with it, I really didn't want another curator's text. I had
Apologies to all curators.
right. I had a wonderful one by Lucille Part in the previous book. I mean, I've had great people who wrote for me, and I really appreciated that. But what kept coming up in my mind was this short story that he had written, 25 years earlier. And it just sort of would keep floating through. So I finally, and I hadn't even reread it for years and years. So I reread it and I thought, this is it. This is great. It has the same feeling as the photos. And there's something about it, even though the photographs don't follow the Devil's Highway, there are a few of them that take place along there. It wasn't, a collaboration like this, but the feeling was there, and Bill agreed to do it.
The story has its root in an experience I had driving Highway 666, the Devil's Highway, up from the immense Morenci copper pit and camping one night in the frozen Blue Mountains, and then on the next morning, being waylaid on the twisty, turny highway. We have more curves per mile than any other highway, I don't know, for some distance. These two guys who'd just come over the border, and they were in rough shape. And so that's the germ of then what gestated and became quite a different account from what I actually experienced. But, I think of the recordation of the world in writing as occupying a kind of spectrum. You have the scholarly article, you have creative nonfiction, you have reality-based fiction, and you can just wander on off into fantasy and romance and so forth. And I've committed sins within those first three categories. And I think that there are times when it's the reality-based fiction that is the door that gets you into the inner life of the actors in the actual world. And so that's what I was trying to do in this story, where each of the characters is conflicted and dealing with different challenges.
I think opening the door into that kind of characterization or conflict, and also opening the door into these particular places, is something that both of your work has in common. It really gets you a kind of portal into that world, this American West. And this is the third book that you all have worked on together. And I wonder what it was like to work on multiple books together, and how you've collaborated in previous works compared to this one. Or
well, I'll take that, because I have to say that there are perils involved in working with Joan. The big thing that we did together was a book, Salt Dreams, Land and Water in Lowdown, California, which is the story of the Salton Sea, and then also somehow became the story of the Imperial Valley and the story of the Colorado River Delta down in Mexico, etc. And
whose fault was that?
it was yours. Let's just be clear. So once upon a time, Joan said, I've been taking these photographs out around the Salton Sea, which is another great place to study decay. And she said, why don't you come on out and see what you think? And I went out there and spent a couple of days with her, and we were driving around and looking at things, and it was fascinating. And I thought, okay, well, I'll write a 5,000 word introduction to some collection of her photographs of the Salton Sea and the various real estate gambits that were launched and all failed around it. Well, 8 years, 235,000 words, and God knows how many books later, we had a book. And along the way, Joan would say, well, that's nice, but you know, you ought to take a look at this. And she is a book collector, among other things. And she always had one more thing to say, have a look at this, have a look at this. And pretty soon we were looking at everything. And
Yes, but also, you know, I started out just working right around the sea, and the next thing I knew, the historian here told me this was part of a big area, and I was going to have to move out. So,
Which
you know,
you
we
did.
did sort of work off each other for quite a long period of time,
Yeah.
and it was an enjoyable process.
Yeah.
And then we did, I did a little book on India, that's the other one, and Bill just wrote a short, very sweet intro for that.
At last I got the chance for the little thing that I had planned.
So the Salton Sea work was the magnum opus that began this relationship then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, Joan said her sort of field work in the Southwest began with the Santa Fe Trail, and that's really where we first connected, because I was doing work on the Santa Fe Trail, and I remember in Hutchinson, Kansas, you and I had an absolutely horrible meal together. This has been one of the problems working with Joan. She only works in places with bad food, so you never want her to do a photographic project on your home. You know, it would be a bad commentary, but we were having an absolutely dreadful meal.
That's true.
And talking about collaborating on
And
something
we
down the
decided
line.
someday we would have to collaborate.
Yeah.
There
yeah.
you go. That was 40 years ago.
And a lot of bad meals ago, yeah.
So one of the things that, as an archive of American history, the Briscoe Center collects and preserves primary source evidence of the past. So I wonder how you think fiction can serve as a form of evidence. Like, what does it get to that we can study?
This is a musical term, a technical term, given us by Van Morrison. There was an article about him in the American Scholar, in which Van Morrison said that what he sought in his music was to achieve the ARG.
Like art.
ARGH. Get to the inner reality of the ecstasy, in his case, in his music. And I think writers, one way or another, and especially in fiction, you're trying to get through to the ARG, as a friend here in graduate school once said to me, David Gaines, he said, Bill, you cannot express the inexpressible, but you have to try. And so that's what fiction allows you to try to do.
It's a great story with a really wonderful ending. You're going to have to get the book to read the ending.
Teaser alert.
Well, with that, I think we can open this up to some questions from the audience. Yeah, we're going to have a microphone that travels around too. Yep.
Yeah, have you talked to or worked with Richard Mishrak?
I have not worked with Richard Misrak, but I'm certainly familiar with his work. And we were, yes, we worked at about the same time. I found that his photographs were much more beautiful, but that the sea had this kind of tension. You know, it was beautiful, but it smelled bad. And so, you know, I wanted the smell in there too. So, you know, we photographed the area very differently, I think. But I have great admiration for his work.
Did you photograph any of your work in film in this book?
There were a couple of images that go back to early work, and they are film, yes. Mm-hmm.
Any questions? Yeah. I don't need the mic. Yeah, you can shout. I'm just curious, Joan, since we are the home of your archive and we're so thrilled for that, what can we expect to come next? What is your next project or focal point that you're currently pursuing?
Well, I just moved, and that's been my project. So I don't know. I actually did a whole project at one point of women aging at age 50. And since I'm now 78, it seemed to me that it was a good time to revisit that. And I'm living in a community of older people, and I see women's bodies and faces as landscapes. So by the time, when you start out and you're young, everybody's skin looks the same. By the time you're 50, every square inch looks different in our faces and bodies. So I actually would like to do something like that. I'm not ready to start traveling again all over the world. We'll see. But I always feel like the best photograph to take, though, is the next one, So I'm always thinking with enthusiasm about whatever that's going to be.
Any other questions? Yes. So we're going to hear you.
Is there anything you miss about using film versus digital?
Actually, I love digital, and I've been doing it, now for a long time. And I like the computer, and I'm comfortable in that arena. Unlike, quite a number of my compatriots that have gone in kicking and screaming, I really liked it. The only thing I miss is I had a Fujica 617 that did a negative about 2¼ inches by 7 inches. That panorama format, you can stitch digital images, but there's nothing like, being able to do it in one shot. And so far, that panorama camera, it isn't out there. But I'm not willing to, I sold mine. I decided I wasn't going to keep trying. I didn't want to process film just a little bit here and there. I miss being in the darkroom, though. You can, turn on a book on tape, and it's just a wonderful thing to be in the darkroom. Much more fun than sitting at the computer.
I have a question. You said something about your book Low Down in California. I think I know the answer to this, but where does that come from?
One of the themes of that book is that in low places, consequences collect. It's fundamentally hydrological. So we wanted to capture that in a phrase. And that's, we also wanted to be a little cheeky and stimulate questions in the reader's mind. So, yeah.
And it is the lowest place, in
Well, it's not the Devil's Highway doesn't also stimulate some questions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Steve?
I just want to say I love the presentation. Thank you so much. My question's for both of you. I'm curious, for the photographer, which photographers have been especially interesting and important for you? The first question from Richard Misrak came to mind, but I'm curious if there are other photographers who you might point to as inspirational. And for the writer, who do you read and especially admire today?
Well, I started out in music, and I found I got a very good photographic education, and early on I was perhaps influenced by Paul Strand and Paul Caponegro and a number of those really early people. And I look at a lot of work, but I have to say that books, music, current events, nonfiction tend to influence me more than other photographers. Even when I see work that I really like, I just tend to sort of plow ahead in my own little path, but I bring in all kinds of other material. When I was first started photographing, I was kind of dismayed because I was working in Los Angeles. It was the late 70s, and Los Angeles at that point was wide open photographically. There were people like Bob Heineken, and their work didn't look anything like what I wanted to do. I mean, I was a very classically trained person. I had ballet, I had math, I had language, I had all this stuff. So I went to my first photography teacher and I said, so what do I do? You know, I'm clearly not in step with what's going on out there. And he said, well, you are who you are, and you can either fight it for the rest of your life or just go with it. So I decided, okay, I'll just go with it. No use fighting myself. So that's where I came from.
And for me, the writers I've read perhaps most deeply, looking for clues as to how I might write, include John McPhee, Peter Matheson. I adore Wallace Stegner, notwithstanding his inability or refusal to include Native Americans in his stories. And then among more recent writers, one of my favorite woman writers is a dear friend, Terry Tempest Williams, and I miss my old pal, Barry Lopez, a lot, recently gone.
Stephanie? No, I'm sorry. You're going to tell.
I. What do I do to change this? It should be on. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. I really love this presentation. I think what you're doing is, both of you, is so interesting. I'm an artist, and I do art about the relationships between landscape and the human beings that live on it. And in particular, I have a PhD in Russian history of all things, and so my art is, again, it's my own crazy, you know, what do you say, lane or whatever. But so I just, you know, this really fascinates me, the issue between landscape and human beings who live in that landscape. And I just wonder what you've done with other parts of the world where you've photographed. Are you still doing the landscape human thing, both on India, the Antarctic?
India, I actually mainly photographed animals. It was sort of it was this little tiny tour, and every time they stopped to look at birds, which they did all the time, and I really there were these incredible birds, but you know, I'm not a wildlife photographer. I didn't even have a long lens with me, so I photographed animals, but that's rare. In Antarctica, I went down with a proposal that said I was going to photograph how humans lived and worked in this place that's really off the planet in terms of how it feels. It changed me forever to go down there, because it's like I saw a quote by William Shatner the other day, the Star Trek guy, who said that when he went into space, he was just really upset because he found there was just a void out there. It's just black. There's nothing human. Well, that's kind of what Antarctica is like. It's all ice. It's just white and blue. And this feeling that we have that's connected, that we're connected somehow to our place, I lost that. Because, yes, we can influence it, and we certainly are, but you go there and you realize that this planet exists separate from us also, and this landscape has got its own sense, and it has nothing whatever to do with us. But, you know, that way that we actually try to inhabit it and make it ours, you know, how do we live in a house, and you know, we claim this house as ours, but we don't really own that house. You know, at some point, our kids are going to have the house, or we're going to sell it, or whatever. It's a temporary loan of this house, and the same thing is true of all that we see out there. So, I mean, I have a sort of warped view, I guess, of our relationship to the landscape, but that's what I'm interested in photographing.
Any other questions? Well, let me thank you for being here with us tonight, and I also particularly, of course, want to thank Joan and Bill, and of course Sarah too. Thank you, and I want to thank you again for being here. And please, as I said, we've got a reception, and these wonderful folks will be happy to sign your books for you. So thanks again for being here.